Mum had a court order saying her 15-year-old son should spend alternate weekends with her. The order still existed. The weekends didn't. Her son had stopped going. Dad said, "He's 15. He doesn't want to go and I'm not forcing him." Mum said Dad wasn't merely respecting their son's wishes. She said he was allowing her to be pushed out. She even raised two words that immediately changed the temperature of the case: parental alienation. So the court had to decide what was actually happening. Was Dad influencing his son against Mum? Was Dad simply being too passive? Or was this a 15-year-old expressing his own clear and increasingly important views? And even if the court decided contact should happen, how exactly was anyone going to make him go? You can write it in an order, you can underline it, you can even put it in bold if you like, but he may just say no. Hello and welcome back to Family Court, You Be the Judge. I'm Neil Andrews, a Mackenzie friend. This is episode 11, The Teenager Who Refused Mum. These are fictionalised scenarios inspired by the situations that can arise in the family courts of England and Wales. The details have been changed, nobody featured is identifiable, and nothing in this video is legal advice. Last time I gave you the basic scenario. A 15-year-old boy refused to spend time with his mother. He said he didn't enjoy contact. He wanted to make his own decisions. Dad agreed that he was old enough to choose. Mum said she was being pushed out of her son's life. So I asked you, can a 15-year-old simply refuse contact? Should the court order him to spend time with Mum? Or is he old enough to decide for himself? I suspect many of you answered fairly quickly. He's 15, you can't force him. And I'll tell you now, that wasn't a bad start. You may already have the broad outcome right. But before the court could reach that decision, it needed to understand why Ethan had stopped going and whether these were genuinely his own wishes. How the arrangement began to fail. Ethan lived with Dad and had spent alternate weekends with Mum for several years. For quite a long time, the arrangement worked reasonably well. Not perfectly, this is family court, but the weekends happened. Ethan maintained a relationship with both parents, and everyone broadly knew where they stood. Then Ethan got older. His weekends became increasingly important to him. There were friends, football, schoolwork, parties, and plans arranged at very short notice. Basically, anything his parents had agreed several months earlier was now competing with something suggested in a group chat 10 minutes before. One weekend, Ethan wanted to see his friends. Another weekend, he had football. Then he said he needed to revise. On another occasion, he simply said he didn't feel like going. At first, Mum tried to be flexible. She swapped weekends. She suggested shorter visits. She offered to collect him and bring him straight back. She suggested a meal instead of an overnight stay. But the replacement arrangements rarely happened. Alternate weekends became occasional weekends. Occasional weekends became a few hours. Then the gaps became longer. And eventually Ethan stopped going altogether. What that meant for Mum. For Ethan, this may have felt like his life changing naturally as he grew older. For Dad, it may have felt like responding to the reality of parenting a teenager. But for Mum, it looks completely different. She hadn't merely lost alternate weekends. She felt like she was slowly losing her place in her son's life. She no longer heard the ordinary details of what had happened at school, if they can remember. How football had gone, which friend he'd fallen out with that day, what he was worried about, what he was excited about. Those small conversations had previously happened naturally, in the car, over dinner, while watching TV. Now Mum received the occasional short message, often after she had contacted him first. She said she became nervous about inviting him anywhere because she expected the answer to be no. But she also felt she couldn't stop asking, because if she stopped, someone might eventually say, well, Mum didn't really make any effort. So she kept offering alternatives: a meal, a few hours, a lift somewhere, anything that allowed her to remain involved. And every time Dad replied, he doesn't want to go. Mum felt the relationship move slightly further away. Her fear wasn't simply that Ethan would miss another weekend. Her fear was that everyone would allow this temporary period of teenage rejection to become permanent. Perhaps Ethan would feel differently at 18 or 25, but by then years might have passed. And relationships aren't always easy to restart simply because everybody decides that enough time's gone by. Mum wasn't asking the judge to make Ethan enjoy contact. She was asking the court not to let the relationship disappear while everybody else stood back and called it his choice. Mum's position. Mum accepted that Dad couldn't physically carry Ethan to the car. At 15, that would be less promoting contact and more somebody being ejected from a reality show. Her argument was that Dad had accepted Ethan's refusal far too easily. Whenever she asked whether Ethan was coming, Dad's answer was effectively, he says no, and that was it. No meaningful discussion. No positive encouragement. No expectation that Ethan should reply to Mum himself. Mum had said that Dad had taken the easiest possible route and called it respecting Ethan's wishes. She accepted that the old alternate weekend arrangement might need to change. What she didn't accept was that Ethan could end the relationship by refusing each individual arrangement until everybody simply gave up. There were no findings that Mum posed a risk. There was no allegation that Ethan was unsafe in her care. And Mum believed Dad's attitude had contributed directly to Ethan's withdrawal. She said Dad had presented her as demanding and unreasonable. She said Ethan had gradually become using phrases that sounded like Dad, and she alleged that this was parental alienation. That allegation mattered, but using those words didn't prove that alienation had occurred. The court still needed evidence. It needed to examine Ethan's reasons, Dad's behaviour, Mum's behaviour, and the wider family dynamics. A child refusing contact doesn't automatically prove parental alienation. But equally, the court couldn't ignore Mum's concern merely because Ethan was 15. Dad's position. Dad denied alienating Ethan. He said he had never told Ethan not to see his mum. He hadn't intercepted messages. He hadn't hidden invitations. He hadn't deliberately organised competing activities during Mum's weekend. He said he'd passed Mum's invitations on. But Ethan was 15. He was capable of expressing a clear view, and he was particularly capable of repeating that view when somebody asked him again. Dad said he wasn't prepared to turn every other Friday into an argument. He believed that more pressure would create more resentment towards Mum. And Dad kept returning to one practical question. What am I actually supposed to do? It's a fair question. The order applied to both parents. The court could examine whether Dad had taken reasonable steps, but there wasn't going to be a court official arriving every other Friday to supervise Ethan getting into the car. Dad said he couldn't guarantee that Ethan would attend. Mum said nobody was asking him for a guarantee. She was asking him to parent. What had Dad actually done? The court examined the messages between the parents. Mum would ask, "Is Ethan coming this weekend?" Dad would reply, "He doesn't want to." Mum would suggest a shorter visit. Dad would say he'd ask. Later, the answer would still be no. Mum would ask what Dad had done to encourage him. Dad would say he's old enough to make his own decision. There was no evidence that Dad had actively instructed Ethan to reject Mum. There was no evidence that he had invented allegations against her. And there was no evidence that Ethan had been coached to repeat a particular account. But the judge also wasn't impressed by Dad's claim that he had become completely powerless because a 15-year-old had expressed an opinion. Parents hear opinions from teenagers every day. Most of those opinions don't immediately become household policy. Dad didn't need to threaten Ethan. He didn't need to punish him. He certainly didn't need to physically force him into the car. But he did need to do more than pass on Mum's invitation and announce that the matter was now out of his hands. Apparently, he says no had become the entire co-parenting strategy. The court wanted to know whether Dad had spoken positively about Mum. Had he explained why their relationship remained important? Had he encouraged Ethan to reply to her? Had he suggested that if a whole weekend felt too much, Ethan should propose something he could manage? The evidence suggested Dad had done very little of that. That didn't automatically make him an alienating parent, but it did suggest that he had been far too passive. Ethan's voice. The court then needed to understand Ethan's position. A Cafcass officer spoke with him away from both parents. Ethan was clear. He didn't say Mum was dangerous. He didn't say he hated her. He didn't say he wanted her removed from his life. He said he no longer wanted fixed alternate weekends. His friends and football were near Dad's home. He preferred sleeping in his own room. He wanted more control over his weekends, and he felt the arrangements no longer reflected his age. He also said contact with Mum had become uncomfortable. Whenever he saw her, she wanted to discuss why he hadn't been coming. From Mum's perspective, that was completely understandable. She was trying to find out what had gone wrong. From Ethan's perspective, though, every visit had started to feel like a review of the previous visit. So he avoided the next one. Then there was even more to discuss, and the pattern continued. Ethan also felt that Mum sometimes made him responsible for how upset she was. He understood why she was hurt, but he said that made seeing her feel like an obligation rather than something he could actually enjoy. That was difficult for Mum to hear. She'd been trying to show Ethan how important he was to her, but the emotional pressure was having the opposite effect. Importantly, Ethan said he wasn't refusing all contact. He would consider a meal, a short outing, a lift somewhere, perhaps an afternoon together. What he opposed was the automatic return of alternate weekend overnight stays. The Cafcass assessment didn't identify evidence that Dad had coached Ethan. Ethan's account was expressed in his own language. He could explain his reasons. His views were consistent. And he showed some understanding of how the situation affected Mum, even though he still wanted the old arrangement to end. So Mum's allegation of parental alienation was not upheld. That didn't mean the court believed Dad had handled everything properly. It meant the evidence didn't support a finding that he had deliberately influenced Ethan into rejecting her. There's an important difference. Does a 15-year-old decide? At this stage, many of you will still be thinking, he's 15, surely that settles it. But the legal answer needs more care. There's no automatic rule saying that once a child reaches 15, they take over the case. The court still makes the decision. Ethan's welfare remained the court's paramount consideration. His wishes and feelings were important, but they had to be considered in light of his age, maturity, and understanding. The court also needed to examine why he held those views. Were they genuinely his? Had they been influenced? Did he understand the consequences? And would forcing contact actually promote his welfare? In Ethan's case, his age mattered, his maturity mattered, his consistent explanation mattered, and the fact that he wasn't rejecting Mum completely also mattered. He was rejecting the existing structure. The court could make Dad take reasonable steps. It couldn't make Ethan enjoy an alternate weekend. And Ethan was approaching 16. The usual ability to make a Section 8 order extending beyond 16 is limited to very exceptional circumstances. So even the legal timetable was becoming short. The court needed an arrangement that could work in practice, not one that looked impressive on paper but still failed every other Friday. Your decision. Before I reveal the outcome, here were the four broad options. Option A, enforce the existing order and require Dad to make the alternate weekends happen. Option B, keep compulsory contact but reduce it to shorter fixed daytime visits. Option C, remove the compulsory weekend arrangement while requiring both parents to support gradual and flexible contact. Or option D, end the order and leave all future contact entirely to Ethan. Which option would you choose? Take a second and remember, there's a difference between listening to Ethan and making a 15-year-old solely responsible for the future of his relationship with Mum. The decision. Did you get it right? The court chose option C. The judge did not order Ethan to return to alternate weekend overnight contact. His views were clear. His reasons were understandable. They had been properly explored. And the court was satisfied that they were genuinely his own. There was no realistic benefit in ordering Dad to deliver a reluctant 15-year-old for a full weekend and then waiting for the completely predictable disaster. So if you said the court won't force him, you were right. Take the point. You read the situation correctly. But Dad didn't receive complete approval from the court. The judge found that he had been too passive. He hadn't alienated Ethan, he hadn't deliberately caused the relationship to collapse, but he had treated Ethan's refusal as the end of his own responsibility. The court rejected that. Dad was expected to speak positively about Mum. He was expected to encourage Ethan to answer her messages. He was expected to support shorter and more manageable forms of direct contact. And he was expected not to present every refusal as a final decision. Mum also needed to change her approach. That didn't mean pretending she wasn't hurt. It didn't mean accepting that her role no longer mattered. It meant removing some of the pressure Ethan associated with seeing her. No repeated questioning. No demand that every visit resolve the entire relationship. And no making Ethan feel responsible for managing Mum's emotions. The existing alternate weekend arrangement was discharged. Mum would continue communicating directly with Ethan. Dad had to ensure communications weren't obstructed and had to encourage reasonable opportunities for Ethan to spend time with her. The aim was shorter, lower pressure contact. A meal, an afternoon, a lift. Something Ethan felt able to accept. And agreeing to one occasion wasn't to be treated as Ethan accidentally signing himself back up to alternate weekends. Why the outcome made sense. This wasn't the court saying that a child can simply cancel a parent. And it wasn't the court saying that every 15-year-old has a legal veto. The court recognised that Ethan's age, maturity and clear wishes carried enormous practical weight. The judge could require Dad to encourage the relationship. The judge could expect Mum to make contact easier for Ethan to accept. But the judge couldn't create a genuine relationship by ordering Ethan to sit in Mum's home for 48 hours. That might satisfy the timetable, it might achieve absolutely nothing else. The court also avoided making one parent entirely responsible for the situation. Mum's fear of losing Ethan was understandable. Dad's concern about trying to force him was also understandable. Ethan's wish for greater control over his time was understandable. The problem was that flexibility had gradually become almost complete withdrawal, and the adults hadn't found a workable replacement. So the court's answer was no. Ethan didn't automatically decide the case, but yes, at 15, his clear and mature wishes were likely to be decisive in practice. Dad still had to encourage the relationship. Mum still remained his mother, and Ethan needed enough space for contact to feel like a relationship rather than enforcement. The verdict. So, how did you do? If you predicted that the court wouldn't force Ethan back into alternate weekend contact, that's a point for you. If you also predicted that Dad would be criticised for doing too little, you get a bonus point. And if you correctly thought that Mum's allegation of parental alienation wouldn't be proved simply because Ethan was refusing contact, then you got 3 out of 3. No appeals in the comments. Now you tell me, would you have reached the same decision if Ethan was 13? What if he was 11? And do you think Dad was genuinely respecting Ethan's views or simply taking the easiest option? Leave your judgment below. And while you're there, hit like, subscribe to Family Court You Be the Judge, and share this episode with somebody who always delivers their verdict before hearing the evidence. There's usually at least one. Now it's your turn again. A brother and sister have always lived together. They've grown up in the same home. They've always followed the same routines and moved between their parents' homes together. But now they want different things. One wants to live with Mum, the other with Dad. Keeping them together means one of them is going to be deeply unhappy. Splitting them means separating siblings who have always had each other. Both parents said the children should be listened to, but both parents also say separating them could cause lasting harm. So here's the question. Should the court keep the siblings together? Or can splitting them between two homes sometimes be the better option? Leave your judgment in the comments, and this is going to be probably the hardest one yet. And next time you'll discover what happened. But until then, you be the judge.